Okay, I'm gonna explain something fairly straightforward. This is the most important concept in game design ever. Okay, if you understand this, you'll immediately be super good at game design. I would say design is a top-down process of backwards induction starting from the end user. Okay, now that's a very jumbled sentence, so I'm gonna need to break that down. Okay. But basically, so backwards induction just basically means you're sort of like forward thinking and thinking about what you want to achieve before you start setting out on achieving it, right? This is a really important concept in game theory and just generally being better at video games in general, okay? So what I mean from that, and what does top down mean? Top down basically is, I think very fundamental, and effectively means decisions are being made like broad decisions by the designer without as much emergent feedback. Okay, so I'm gonna split things into two categories here. So we're gonna say D for design, and I'm gonna say E for emergence. Okay, so these are two completely opposite things. And what design is basically you sit and you think about what people want, and you will effectively come to the conclusion that, there's so many people that want this thing, let's go ahead and make it in this way. So design is it's gonna be somewhat, okay, so design can be somewhat data driven, but only if you're willing to really translate the data, right? Because data is often very, very, very mischaracterized. And I actually think data driven processes are a large part of the reason why games fail. But when you have emergent design, you end up with a lot less control over your finished product. So what that's going to mean is basically these are things that a lot of stuff here is like the kind of like wouldn't it be cool with idea. Like the problem with Underlords, not the game, the units, is that there's no like design behind them, right? It's just kind of like a wouldn't it be cool if, right? Like I've mentioned before, like Underlords are just like, hey, let's just add some units. But there's not really a reason for it. Like they don't really contribute anything to the game. It's just more of like how they establish the lore into it. Also, you might say that in this process, there's a lot of like lore before mechanics approaches, which I would also like I would characterize here. Lore is important, but you don't want to over prioritize it more than like the actual core gameplay loops, right? So if you want a feeling of like the Underlords fighting with your team, you should try to get that feeling in a different way, right? Evolution equals doing things randomly for no reason. Sort of, not exactly. So when I say evolution as a process, you can think of it on a few different levels, okay? So when I say evolution as a process, I'm not saying every game company is going to do a random thing, and the good game companies are and the ones that do the correct random things are gonna grow. That's not what I mean, although that's honestly with a lot of companies that does end up being somewhat true, but that's not what I mean. What I mean specifically is in terms of the individual decisions that companies make, they will kind of adopt a very iterative approach, right? Like they'll tweak things here, they'll tweak things there, and they won't effectively. It takes one big meeting at the start. Like when you're gonna launch the game, you need to make sure the fundamentals are in order. I think a lot of people make the mistake of basically a lot of devs will launch way too early, and they'll build a player base that gives them momentum but inertia at the same time, right? And they will obviously not a big player base, and the problem is that the core foundation of the game isn't well tested and doesn't it really paints them into a corner, right? And a lot of people just feel like if you just iterate and iterate and iterate enough, you can always get things into the right spot. And I really, really heavily disagree with that, right? So I think the most important thing about a game is is to not have that super iterative approach. You'll notice that both Gwent and Underlords took that hyper iterative approach, right? Where Gwent was a product that wasn't designed. It was basically, it came from The Witcher 3. It basically, they didn't really try to translate it from The Witcher 3. I mean, and the reason for that is CDPR did not expect Gwent to be as big as it was. At first, it was just meant to be some like really small side project, just kind of like for the fans, right? But it ended up blowing up just because of its timing in the space, right? And the problem was, like, Gwent, they basically just ported it from The Witcher 3, and we're like, okay, if we just change it here for a month and just change it and just change it and just change it and just change it, and we just keep changing it, eventually it'll be a good game, right? I really don't like that approach. And that's the kind of like evolution, iterative approach, right? You're trying to, the emergent approach, because you're just hoping that out of all of that chaos, a good game will emerge, right? This like, yes, this is chaos, literally. Like, it is, oops, you guys can't see, but I promise the rest of the word chaos is there. This is literally a very chaotic approach, right? It's not very structured, it's not very designed. So what is design then? Well, like I said, it's a top-down process of backward induction starting from the end user. So the first step in designing a game, the first step, and this is really, really important, before you have anything, before you have words, before you have a board, before you have any cards, before you have any concepts, literally the first step is, what do people want? Like, what kind of game do people even want? That's the number one step. I see a lot of people literally skipping that step. Like they'll do a game that's like interesting or cool or different, but they're not really asking themselves what concepts people end up wanting out of certain kinds of games. And a lot of it comes down to timing, right? Because everything changes. Like, you know, every 5 years, the gaming climate is like continuously shifting pretty aggressively, right? But the point is that these like iterative approaches are, I think, usually just doomed to failure, right? So, I mean, you need to be in a position where you're, you know, willing to crack down and do a lot of research on what people actually want and understand very clearly how you should structure a game to kind of build with that. Maybe design is kind of like building a house out of bricks, where it's like you have to take the time and you have to set it up first. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money, but you're creating something people want. And emergence or iteration or whatever you want to call it is basically the idea of building a house out of Legos. And the argument is like, well, we'll build the house and then we can just change things easily if we don't like it. And the problem is, you're building a house out of Legos for somebody to try to live in, right? That's the problem. It's like, yes, you're flexible. Yes, you're pivotable. You end up changing things a lot. And it's an interesting sell. It is. But it's not design. You're not, it literally is a process that I would not call design. It's just you're sitting there and you're putting together this, you know, this house, and you're staying very, very flexible in your approach, and you're changing things as you go. Like someone's living in your house, and you know you're just there in the mornings, just like you're like, well, this ceiling is actually a little too high. Let's actually make it a little lower or something like that, right? Like that's the thing to understand. It's like just constantly changing things like while someone is living there doesn't make sense. Right? Like the ideal of trying to approach an emergent good game by doing that is, I personally think, very flawed. There might be a couple exceptions. Like at the end of the day, a lot of things are just generalizations. But that's the number one important thing to understand about like design concepts in general. I want to give you one more example, okay? This is something that's really, really important, but this is just another way of looking at it. So this is the concept of local maxima, which is a very, very important concept in evolution engineering and machine learning. So if you basically look at a situation like this, so this is a graph. This is meant to be a graph, and we've got, you know, this axis. I'm gonna, oops, wait. Let me zoom out so you guys can actually see what I'm fucking talking about. Wait a second. Wait, it's too big. Okay, so this is basically, you know, this axis represents, oops, okay, now it's too far that way. So this is going to represent, let's say, value, right? Value is super ambiguous. This can be just like good design, something that does well, something that does its job well, basically, something that you want, right? And this axis ambiguously represents a effective difference in similarity of ideas. It's hard to explain in a sentence. What's a good way of explaining this? It's sort of like idea space. There's a much easier way of explaining this. I'm doing the hard way for no reason. And the idea of this is basically that similar ideas are basically going to be adjacent to each other, right? So if this is like a two-dimensional axis representing idea space, right? And this is the difference between these problems, right? So let's say you're right here. This can be anything. Again, this applies to all forms of design ever, and all forms of evolution ever. This has nothing to do with game design. But if you're building a deck, if you're like working on like a product, if you are a game designer, if what you're working on is right here, then evolution will say, okay, let's take a little step to the right, see what happens. Oh, I really didn't like that. Let's take another step to the right and see if we like that. Wow, we really didn't like that. Okay, let's try going left. Oh, this is good. Let's go left again. Oh, this is good. And then you end up here, right? Obviously, you realize there's nothing good here as well. So you end up here. And this is pretty straightforward. And again, this is called local maximum. It's a very common thing. So you'll find this in a lot of machine learning programs, which are machine learning is a process of evolution. Now, if you wanted to kind of counteract this whole point of making, I'm saying engineering is able to do things evolution can't, and evolution is fast and efficient in some ways. Machine learning is a good example of efficient evolution, and also the existence of everything as we know it, I guess, is another decent example. I mean, whatever, who cares? That's not my point. The point is, this very commonly in evolutionary processes, you have this problem right here, where you get stuck, and you'll be on this hill forever. You'll die on this hill. You will live your entire lifetime here, not realizing like what you could have done or what you could have been, right? Instead of just going a little to the further right and going here, right? That's and again, it's something that, you know, machine learning really struggles with. There's a lot of people like trying to figure out like better ways of optimizing that. It's a problem with just the approach of iteration and attempting, you know, minor adjustments, seeing how those minor adjustments play out, instead of kind of backing up and understanding the terrain, right? Because when you just at the offset of your project, if you understand like what people want, and you think like, okay, you start with what people want, you just zoom out, take a broad picture of the landscape, and figure out like where you want to be and how you want to get there, right? And it takes time, and for a lot of indie developers, it might not be feasible, honestly, because it means that you will have to spend time and money, right? So you'll need some amount of like income, and that's where I guess like, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get that. Most common ones are like crowdfunding, stuff like Kickstarter and Indiegogo. That's like why those companies have been able to like create good projects, because it basically alleviates pressure, right? It means you have time to just kind of like take your idea and sort of incubate it and spend some time thinking about what you want it to look like, so that you don't get stuck here for your game's entire lifetime, right? That's it. Okay. I mean, like I think it's a really important process to understand. I said something specifically, something very important like 20 minutes ago, okay? I said simply that the Underlords deploying at round 10 is the best short-term solution they could make, okay? So you look at that from the framework of local maximum. And I mean, obviously it's a very complicated, if we want to do something, if we want something more realistic, it'll have like a lot of different hills, and it'll be like 3D or 4D or something. The point is it's a complicated terrain, and this is a model for understanding, so you can see it on 2D, but it's not going to be great. So my point is, you know, maybe Underlords is here, and, you know, making the Underlords like round 10 heroes move in this direction, and it gets a bit better. And that's the important thing to understand. So like you guys are saying, the game feels better without creep-rounds. And the problem is, yeah, I mean, that's true, but that doesn't mean it's the right direction, right? I think that I would say I do generally lean towards the idea that cutting creep rounds is the right decision. But if you imagine something fairly different, there could be a fairly different style of game that tries to embrace them more. It really just depends on embracing like what your goal in the market is. Valve was in a position with Underlords where it was competing against TFT, and because of that, it should have embraced the mobile market more. And its biggest problem was games got really long instead of getting shorter. Because a lot of people were actually checking Underlords out on mobile and tried it a few times, and then just realized these 30-minute games are too much for me, right? And that's it. So I don't know. At the end of the day, the correct solution is open to interpretation. It just depends on your goals as a game, right? If you want to compete in the mobile space, then go in one way. If you want to try to do a different thing, then go in a different way. And the timing changes everything. Because at the start, I am of the opinion, and you might say that Chess Rush was a major competitor, so it shouldn't have gone mobile. At the start, I'm an opinion that Underlords should have gone more into mobile. Basically, if it had done effectively what Battlegrounds... I'm envisioning something different from Underlords, by the way. I would envision something closer to Battlegrounds. Closer to Hearthstone Battlegrounds. I think that probably would have been a better idea. Like for example, something like more like turbo mode. Not literally turbo mode. Like it's important that it has like complexity, and obviously it's not literally random. But it's important to realize the reason that turbo mode is kind of a joke of kind of like not balanced and just kind of a meme. A lot of you guys are probably like, well, Swim is crazy. Turbo mode would be a terrible game mode. The reason turbo mode's not an amazing mode, as an example, is just because it's secondary. And it has to be secondary because their primary product is, you know, the base gameplay mode, right? So, or knockout mode. Oh, sorry, it's called knockout mode. Knockout mode is always going to be secondary, and it's always going to feel a little like worse for it. But I think at the time, like when the game launched, making it something like just making one product and no modes, making it not literally knockout mode, but something that incentivized like shorter games with skill built in, which they can do, obviously. I mean, it's a little trickier to have a lot of skill with shorter games, but you can totally do it. Would have been a direction I would have thought about going in. Alternatively, there's a lot of arguments, and I'm sure you guys are making these arguments, that you want to go in the other direction, you know? Maybe try to like compete with TFT to be kind of like the kind of longer game product. And at the end of the day, I mean, you're competing for a lot of viewership, but there are you do have some player base that will play you, that won't play TFT. Those are basically Dota fans or Valve fans or people that just don't like Riot or they're, you know, something in general, you know, whatever. There's a lot of different things there, right? But the point is timing completely changes what direction you might want to go in. Like right now, I would say it's definitely too late to try to go down the knockout mode path, right? And that's exactly what I mean when I say that these changes just feel kind of too little too late. And which isn't even to say that they're bad or I wouldn't have done them, I'm not sure. But the idea of like trying to, because TFT and Hearthstone Battlegrounds are both much better at having like these kind of like shorter, more enjoyable experiences. There's an argument that Underlords should have like more embraced what made it unique instead of trying to like compete in these like more competitive areas. I'm not saying I would have done that, but that's just an argument. The point is, it's not so simple as, oh, the game feels better because neutral creeps aren't in it, so therefore I agree with neutral creeps being taken out. That's the most important thing. That's why this conversation got started. Because somebody said the game feels better with neutral creeps not in it. And that's true. But it's important to identify that that does not necessarily mean that it was the direction that should have been gone in. Themselves. Underlords have changed based on community feedback. Yuck. Yuck, 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 yuck. Gross. See, this is... I mean, maybe this is just a line. You know, who knows. Community feedback is... To wrap up this talk, because we're not still finished about this talk, community feedback is part of this entire problem, right? You have to understand that. Now, this is a little complicated. This is a little complicated to explain, okay? Basically, the point is that listening too much to your community can kill your game. And that's simple to understand. For example... there's a lot of things that people will complain about that aren't really issues or are sort of necessary evils. Something that's keeping something down in a meta ecosystem. Take, for example, the noble house spider. House spider is a great pet. I actually, like, every couple of months, I go out and I buy, like, 3 or 4 house spiders at a pet store, and I put them in my house, because because I don't get bugs on my house because I have a few house spiders crawling around, right? But the thing to understand is nobody likes house spiders, just instinctually. But when you nerf the house spiders, you don't like that anymore, right? But yeah, I got the idea from Graves, an old Gwent buddy. He and I worked on Gwent together. And yeah, he had a house spider. I think it was called George or something like that. But basically, the idea is, if you listen to your players, there's a lot of biases in terms of what they'll complain about. So my assertion is a lot of games can die by listening to their players too much, but a lot of games can also die by not listening to their players enough. So how do you find the balance, and what do you have to do about that exactly? It's tricky, right? It is. But, you know, the big problem about players is they tend to, again, it's this local maxima thing. It's like, oh, this feels better. But again, as a designer, your job is to not do things based on what is better, you know, in that iteration, because otherwise you just end up stuck somewhere you don't want to be and never growing, never leaving this hill, right? Like you're just trapped on this hill. It would nightmare zone just because your players will complain if things go here or things go here, right? And that just happens sometimes, right? But again, players are also, you know, biased in some ways. There's the house spider thing I was just talking about. A really big thing is that your player base isn't necessarily a reflection of the market. A lot of the players play your game because they like certain things about your game. As a random example, someone pointed out before that Artifact got the most praise for its draft mode. A lot of people liked Artifact's draft mode. I've made the assertion that Artifact's draft mode is single-handedly one of the worst things about Artifact, and arguably one of the bigger reasons that Artifact died, which is surprising to most people, and most people don't really understand that. But the idea is, because of its focus on that, you see Artifact is in a situation where its biggest praise actually came from its draft mode. So here's the worry. Artifact's relaunch, maybe they listen too much to that. If they listen too much to their player base for Artifact's relaunch, they're going to be like, well, the one thing we did right is the draft mode. Therefore, we should make sure that the draft mode is good. And therein lies the problem. Because that's like this hill right here, where any direction is really good, but you're just stuck on that hill because that's the feedback you're getting from your players. Because it's like, oh, don't go that way. Oh, don't go that way, right? That's no good, right? So an additional problem is, of course, you know, your current players aren't a reflection of the market. Like I said, players will play your game because they don't hate it, and maybe a lot of people played your game and then left without giving you feedback, right? So you enter like a statistical bias territory where it's, you know, it's a selection bias. Basically just means that the pool of people you are, the sample of people that you are polling is in and of itself been selected by some kind of bias. In this case, the people that already play your game instead of the people that don't, right? And it's important to understand, you know, why people aren't playing your game and the complaints there, and those matter a lot more, right? Because otherwise you'll get stuck on this hill and you'll over-design for draft mode and your game will die again, right? So again, this is a lot of like data-driven processes as well, because data-driven processes are evolutionary processes. They are iterative. Data-driven processes will get stuck on these hills. Now, the trick is to basically be able to interpret data and interpret feedback. And that's the goal. And that's tricky and that's hard. But the point I'm making in all of this is that your players and your data will give you valuable feedback, but you need to know how to translate it into decision making. You need to know what feedback to listen to and what feedback not to listen to. You can't just make decisions based on data. You can't just say that, oh, this card has a really high play rate, let's nerf it, right? Oh, this card has a really low play rate, let's nerf it, right? I think that a lot of companies are very data-driven, and I think being data-driven as a process is actually fine as long as you are taking a lot of time to interpret the data and making sure you're not like over following the data, just like kind of blindly following it. Because otherwise, again, data being, you know, an evolutionary process, you will get stuck in these zones and nothing is going to happen with your game, right? I think this is a pretty large problem with Valve in general, honestly. I think this is apparent. I think this is brutally apparent in both Underlords as well as Artifact. If you look at like Artifact patch notes, the data-driven process, you know, it's just like basically like this is just some random example. This is meaningless, but these were the Artifact patch notes for basically the one patch that they effectively ever did, right? And I can tell you, like, almost certainly I can say that these are extremely data-driven. It's like, and I know that for a fact. You know how I know that? Because I know that in the beta, and this is public knowledge, in the beta, when a lot of people were giving feedback to certain cards, a lot of you guys might know Cheating Death used to cost 3 mana. it used to be, instead of 5 mana, it did the same thing. It was allies have a 50% chance of surviving with 1 health for the entire lane. It was not this new effect. It was the old one at 3 mana, okay, in the beta period. A lot of people know that. What some people know, but a lot of people don't know, is that Valve's argument for keeping it at 3 mana for so many months in the closed beta period was because of data. A lot of people said cheating death at 3 mana is hyper bullshit and needs to get nerfed. And there was basically talk of like, the data says it's fine, so we're going to keep it at 3 mana for now, right? And I think that's a really, really flawed process of game design, personally. I see a lot of those patterns in Underlords, and you if you're looking, you can kind of see them in this too. Like artifacts in a state where, you know, a lot of things are really poor about like the gameplay experience. And, you know, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a quick fix solution. It's not really meant to correct like very major and broad things, but, you know, artifacts in a very, very dire state, and they're doing stuff like, you know, they're just doing basically a few nerfs, and the nerfs I guess help, but they're band-aid solutions. And then they're taking like things with really weak play rates and like buffing them, right? Like for example, like they looked at the data and they're like, okay, black has a really low play rate or win rate, and these 2 heroes within black are even lower. So let's buff black and let's buff these heroes by buffing this. So they buff Bloodseeker and they buff Lion, right? And maybe Timbersaw had like a low play rate too, so they buff Timbersaw. And then when you actually, if you're an artifacts player and you understand those things, you'll understand that this is kind of ludicrous. Like, none of this matters. You know, the game was in a pretty dire situation, and none of this really addresses anything, right? It doesn't, the data doesn't really reflect like what the actual issues are, right? And that's really, really, really important to understand. That's the trap of data. Data is a really, really, really big trap for developers. And whether you're taking like actual raw data from your servers or whether you're pulling players, it's still the same trap. It's the same thing. It's different types of data. So what you need to do as a developer is you need to take data and you need to understand what your players are saying, but you need to know when to ignore it. And that's really important. As an example, whenever there's a problem, you know, the question, again, just, I'm serious. Like, you're going to do much better in, like, I mean, it depends what you want to do with your life, but I think it's a really, really important mentality in literally no matter what you're doing with your life to understand this concept of local maxima. I'm not really exaggerating when I say this changed the way I thought about like a lot of decisions in my life. Seriously. So like, the most important thing is to understand very simply that when there's a combination of 2 things that aren't working well, we can't assume that it was the thing that was most recently changed. Okay? That's it. Right? And that's the problem with iterative-based approaches. That's the problem with this idea of emergent design, evolution, and one of the problems of local maxima. This is the same conversation, so you're not going to understand this if you weren't here an hour ago. But my point is very simple. If you do this kind of design, again, imagine evolution. If you sometimes taking a step in the right direction is going to get punished. A bird a prehistoric dinosaur is trying to evolve into a prehistoric bird. Okay, okay. So what that means is like, let's say, you know, you've got this land dinosaur, and here it is. This is your land dinosaur, and you know how evolution works. I'm not going to explain the biology of very, very basic evolution, but it basically iterates into, you know, a generation that is a little bit lighter. Like, they weigh less. But until a certain point, you are not going to get an advantage out of weighing less, right? That can be a disadvantage, right? That can be like down this hill. And obviously, you know, birds did evolve. So over a period of enough time, if you have enough time, you will find a lot of solutions. Not the best solutions. And B, it takes a fuck ton of time, more than anyone could possibly ever have. Right? That's it. So when you think in those terms, the most important thing to understand is what is the problem, right? Because you're combining 2 factors. Like, okay, so let's say this symbol represents land animal. This symbol represents a trait that makes you a little bit lighter. And this symbol represents a bird dinosaur, okay? Or something like that, right? So the important thing to understand is that when you combine these two factors together, they don't work well together. Yes, sure, absolutely, 100%. When you combine these two together, it's a mistake. But that doesn't matter, because the conclusion that says that this is bad is not a fair conclusion. But that's the conclusion evolution processes will always come to, until they don't, which again takes a long period of time. But you'll have a process where, you know, you have a trait passed along. It'll be, you know, or not passed along, but effectively just deviating. And you've got this, you know, lightness trait, and it's a mistake. And so evolution will self-correct. It'll say, out of here, right? Because how these processes will always work is basically they will revert to the, like, less recent one, right? Like, if there was a change and it deems this change to be negative, it just reverts back to this. And this is just what we're staying with, right? That's the problem. It decides, and this is the kind of most efficient way to algorithmically do it in a super, super basic way, but it decides that out of the combination of this, that this is the problem one. And maybe that's not true. That could easily not be true, right? That's the biggest problem. Because maybe in reality, this is actually the problem, and in reality, this is good, but just needs to be combined with this. Do you understand? That's the most important thing to take away from here. And that's my point with jail. It's like, jail is yes. It's like, you guys are envisioning land animals, and I'm like, well, okay. I mean, jail is this. It's weird. It's bizarre. It doesn't really fit it. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm agreeing that this is a weird combination, which is something that I wasn't really right about before, because I thought like this would kind of work fine. But the more I think about it, I am realizing it will have to look very different to work. Sure, I agree with that. And my point is basically, it's hard to decide that this is bad just based on the combination of this is bad. That's my entire point. So the response of change was bad, revert. It's a process of reversion, right? It's like I installed a virus. I'm going to like I'm going to back up my Windows to like the reverted state right before I got that virus, right? And this is just how evolutionary processes work. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not exactly efficient, and you're going to be stuck in these areas by doing this, right?
Okay, what fucked up drawing stream did I just tune into?
And that's my point. That's my entire point. I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong either. I want to be clear on that. I'm not saying that definitively jail is the best way to move the game moving forward. All I'm saying is that anyone saying jail had to go is not thinking about it enough, because it's too complex of an issue to come to a conclusion that easily. You can't say anything definitive very easily. That's it. Okay? All right.